Good afternoon, Pastor Stecker here with Grace Lutheran Church here in Nashua, New Hampshire, as we continue our Bible study here on Paul the Apostle. Today we're looking at chapter 13, which outlines Paul's time right after his imprisonment in Ephesus, and especially focusing on his letters to 2 Corinthians and to Romans. Happy Wednesday. Welcome back as we continue our study on the Apostle Paul based on the biography written by Mr. N.T. Wright. Today we'll be looking at the time in Paul's life immediately after his supposed Ephesian imprisonment, where much of his letters were written. We will then take the majority of our time to break down a few of the concepts of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, along with his famous epistle, Romans. As Romans may be one of his finest theological works, a well thought out and worked through theological exposition, we will make sure to take most of our time to focus on this letter, mainly the purpose and structure, along with what was going on in the Roman churches that led to the writing of this letter. Let's dive in. Wright supposes that Paul was released from his imprisonment in Ephesus sometime in the middle to late 56 AD. As noted in an earlier study, time spent in a first century Greco-Roman prison was something which would have left a lasting impression. As Wright notes, you don't merely shake things off and emerge into the sunlight smiling. The mental scars often far outlive the physical ones. However, as detrimental as these mental scars may be, the lingering worry that all of this might be in vain is what haunted him the most. At this time, his greatest ministry accomplishment, the church in Corinth, was still seemingly rejecting him. They had turned to other more flashy teachers, and many had rejected Paul in his previous teachings. This is what made him wonder if all of this heartache was actually accomplishing anything, or if he was on a pointless mission. Many missionaries, pastors, and laymen may easily relate to Paul here. But Paul at this time soldiers on, traveling to some of the same cities that he visited on his earlier missionary journey, hoping to find Titus among other things, and all the while forming his second letter to the Corinthians. And then finally it happens. Paul is able to meet up with Titus, who brings news that the Corinthians had repented of their ways and had welcomed Paul and his teachings back into their church. As Paul himself writes, "The God who comforts the downcast comforted us by the arrival of Titus, and not only by his arrival, but in the comfort he had received from you, as he told us about your longing for us, your lamenting, and your enthusiasm for me personally. As a result, I was more inclined to celebrate, because if I did make you sad by my letter, I don't regret it. And if I did regret it, it was because I saw that I made you sad for a while by what I had written. Anyway, I'm celebrating now not because you were saddened, but because your sadness brought you to repentance. It was a sadness from God, you see, and it did you no harm at all on our account. The real celebration, though, on top of all our comfort, came because Titus was so overjoyed. You really did cheer him up and set his mind at rest. I am celebrating the fact that I have confidence in you in everything." This experience, the ups and downs, are what shaped 2 Corinthians. As previously discussed, Paul starts this letter in a deeply saddened state, but soon changes his tone as he hears the reports of good news delivered from Titus, and then moves on to discuss planning for the fundraising for the church in Jerusalem. Throughout all of this, he articulates and shows, through both rhetoric and experience, how the love of God brings an otherworldly gift of reconciliation. One important takeaway from Paul's exhortation and teaching about how love brings reconciliation is that he sees the kind of love as utterly unique to the Christian message and through the Messiah. First, Paul sees that it is only by counting the cost of the Messiah's love for him that he can turn around and reciprocate that love to those around him. This is what leads to reconciliation for Paul and for the early Christian church. Forgive because ye have been forgiven. But second, he showcases that this message of love is made strong through weakness. As he says elsewhere, Jews demand signs, Greeks seek after wisdom, but for Christians, they get a crucified Messiah, and once more, they get a suffering apostle. And notably, one of the funniest flights of rhetoric anywhere in the New Testament, Paul shows what the suffering apostle looks like, and importantly, what he doesn't look like. This takes place in chapters 11 and 12. But to understand what is going on here, we need to understand how Roman culture worked, particularly how Roman prestige was understood. There was something called cursus honorum, or course honors, where statesmen, at the end of their political careers, would record in stone or marble all of the accomplishments that happened under their reign. This would then solidify that they were a successful and worthwhile leader. Another important term was corona moralis, which means wall crown. This was a reward of prestige given to the soldier who was the first to scale an enemy wall. Point being, it was standard to showcase your brave and heroic accomplishments to show yourself as successful and worthy of respect. And of course, one of the problems in the Corinth church was that many wished for their own leader to have these same heroic qualities. And because of this, many went after other teachers and rejected the absent Paul. This is what led to the dispute and the overwhelming feeling of abandonment on Paul's behalf. So of course, here Paul both showcases his own rhetorical skill while mocking this Romanist mistake that some in the Corinth church had committed. Famously, Paul boasts about all the wrong things, comedically giving his own version of the cursus honorum and even the corona moralis. Listen to what he says. Are they servants of the Messiah? I'm talking like a raving madman. I'm a better one. I've worked harder, been in prison more often, been beaten more times than I can count, and I've often been close to death. 5 times I've had the Jewish beating, 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I was adrift in the sea for a night and a day. I've been constantly traveling, facing dangers from rivers, dangers from brigands, dangers from my own people, dangers from foreigners, dangers in the town, dangers in the countryside, dangers at sea, dangers from false believers. I've toiled and labored. I've burned the candle at both ends. I've been hungry and thirsty. I've been gone without food altogether. I've been cold and naked. Quite apart from all that, I have this daily pressure on me, my care for all the churches. Who is weak and I'm not weak? Who is offended without me burning with shame? If I must boast, I will boast of my weaknesses. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. In Damascus, King Aretas, the local ruler, was guarding the city of Damascus so that he could capture me. But I was let down in a basket through a window and over the wall, and I escaped his clutches. If you want my list of achievements, Paul says, well, here you go. And at the climax of it all, he even declares himself as the king of the wall while fleeing from King Aretas. Whoever said that the Bible was boring? We will now pivot to arguably the most famous and certainly the most thought out and polished of Paul's letters, Romans. Luther, among others, stated that this was his most famous of all of the New Testament epistles. This letter was most likely written in the spring or summer of AD 57, and it was written for specific reasons relating to Paul's mission and vision. The first thing to note is that Paul was planning on pivoting his mission and moving westward, first to Rome and eventually on to Spain. While he certainly always wished to spread the gospel to all people, as previously noted, his missionary journeys were shaped by a specific mission, to strategically plant churches in major centers of Roman influence, to show that a new king had arrived who was more powerful than any of the pagan gods of old, and certainly more so than Kyrios or Lord Caesar. Ultimately, Paul wished to go to Spain, but to do so, he felt he needed the church in Rome to be a flagship who would support his mission westward. At least this was his plan. The second thing to note is that Emperor Claudius, in AD 41, had banished the Jews from Rome due to some rioting. This meant that the church that sprouted up in Rome was mostly made up of Gentile Christians, and this led to some issues which needed addressing. To give an example of the long-seated issues which could have arisen in the church in Rome, we can look to an important heresy that crept into the church in the 2nd century. This heresy, or false teaching, that was condemned by the church was taught by a leader named Marcion. Basically, Marcion taught that the God of Jesus was sharply distinguished from the God of the Jews, meaning that the teaching of Jesus stood separate and even against the teaching of the Old Testament scriptures. Instead of Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament scriptures, Marcion taught that Jesus abolished and replaced the Old Testament scriptures. This was adamantly rejected by the early Christian church, but his teachings can still be found creeping into the church today. This was one of Paul's fears, that because the church in Rome was primarily Gentile, that ideas may creep in that the Jewish traditions and scriptures were no longer relevant. But this, of course, was as far from Paul's understanding as anything could be. As stated earlier, Paul never converted from Judaism to a new religion, but saw Jesus as fulfilling the Old Testament scriptures. Of course, any ideas that may creep into the church to the contrary would be adamantly opposed by Paul. In many ways, Paul, and especially his letter to the Romans, would forever oppose teachers such as Marcion, or those teaching Gnosticism, showing that Christianity is not about abolishing old things or merely inner discovery, but it's about proclaiming the rescue and public message that the one true God of Israel had rescued his people and overthrown the principalities and dark powers of the world, erecting Jesus, his own son, as the king of all creation. The last important thing for us to note is that in almost every city where Christianity had spread up until this point, there was basically one church. Meaning if there were disagreements, they happened within the one church body, such as we saw in Corinthians. But in Rome, there were numerous and separate house churches, meaning that there very well could be different versions of teaching going on. Because of this, another one of Paul's primary goals in Romans was to unify the churches in one thorough understanding. This would be essential if he was going to use Rome as a flagship for his journey further west into Spain. So, in summary, the purpose of Romans was to first cement Rome as a church body that could support his mission westward. He wanted them to be a flagship church. But in order to do that, he needed to unite the churches around a firm and thoughtful theology, which he now taught in great detail in his letter. And one of the main thrusts of this theology was to cement the Jesus movement firmly in Israel's history and as a proper form of worshiping the one true God. Now, we can move to the layout of the letter. Romans can be broken into 4 sections, all that work together to create a wonderful symphonic masterpiece. Wright notes that while each section can be studied on its own, it is often very beneficial to read the entire letter in one sitting, which would have been common in the early church. This is because each section plays off of the other sections to paint a grand theological vision in the mind of the readers. Wright also notes that this very well may be the most ecstatic, exhilarating, dense, and difficult, intellectually and spiritually challenging and rewarding writings from any period in church or world history. The first section is found in chapters 1 through 4. Here, Paul works to show how God has revealed what his covenant purposes were. Covenant is another word for testament and brings to mind the promises that God has made to his people over the years. In chapters 1 through 4, Paul shows how this covenant that God made always had in mind the coming of Jesus, who would fulfill the covenant, forgive the sins of his people, and that now a Jew plus Gentile covenant family existed, and that this was what the church was. Paul's first point is to root all of our Christian principles and beliefs in the faithful covenant that God has made with his people, rooted and grounded in the life and saving actions of Jesus Christ. Wright notes how understanding the faithfulness of God is essential to understanding everything else in the book of Romans. He writes, "Now, therefore, the loyal faith by which a Jew or Gentile reaches out to grasp the promise, believing in the God who raises the dead, would be the one and only badge of membership in Abraham's family. The family could not be created either by circumcision, which was added later than Genesis 15, or by following the law, which was added hundreds of years afterward. It could only be a fresh act of God's grace, received by faith. The use of Romans 1 through 4 in popular teaching today to declare universal human sinfulness and justification by grace alone and through faith alone is fine as far as it goes. Sadly, it routinely shrinks what Paul is actually saying in these chapters and fails to see that they are only one part of a larger argument and do not make full sense without the material that then follows. Romans is not written to explain how people may be saved. It describes that, to be sure, vividly and compellingly, but it does so in order to highlight the faithfulness of God, and with that, the challenges facing the covenant people. Those were the themes the Roman church urgently needed to understand. The foundation now laid in the Abrahamic promise. Paul then moves to his second section found in chapters 5 through 8, which follows the biblical story of the Exodus account. See how he is rooting everything in the Old Testament scriptures? These chapters work to show how the Exodus story of the Israelites, those in the covenant relationship with the one true God, as they are brought out of Egypt, directly relates to and foreshadows what Jesus does for the church. Wright again shows us Paul's vision of connecting the Messiah as the new and greater Exodus story. He writes, Paul retells the Exodus narrative. Coming through the waters of baptism, chapter 6, is like going through the Red Sea, leaving behind slavery and discovering freedom. But then Israel arriving at Mount Sinai and is given the Torah, which promptly declares that Israel has already transgressed. Indeed, as Deuteronomy made clear, the Torah simply brought Israel to the place of exile, of a new kind of slavery. The lament at the close of chapter 7 is the lament seen with gospel hindsight of the Jew who rightly celebrates the Torah and longs to be loyal to it, but finds that loyalty thwarted by the dark Adamic strain that runs through all humans, Jews included. This is the complex problem. Adam's problem, if you like, magnified enormously in the rebellion of God's own people, to which Romans 8 is the matchless answer. The death of the Messiah and the gift of the Spirit together do what the law was incapable of doing. That is, giving the life the law promised but could not bring about because of human and Israelite sin. Throughout chapter 8, Paul hints at a key theme from Exodus and from early Christianity as a whole, as the glorious divine presence guided the children of Israel through the wilderness, coming to dwell in the tabernacle. So the Spirit leads the Messiah's people to their inheritance, which turns out to be not a single promised land, but the entire renewed creation. Next, Paul's third section, chapters 9 through 11, aims to summarize that the purpose of the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, was to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. This has often been summarized by the following statement: the Messiah is the goal of the law being the Torah. The Messiah is the goal of the law so that the covenant membership may be available to all who believe. Paul shows us that Israel's story, which is the story of God's faithfulness to Israel, reaches its climax in the coming of the Messiah. And that only by understanding this history can we possibly understand what Jesus' life, death, and resurrection means. Even though this letter preceded Marcion, it stands as a firm blow to anyone who would try and simplify the Christian message to something which omits the Old Testament scriptures and stories. The final sections of Romans is chapters 12 through 16, where Paul moves to teach that the faithful Christian life is one that moves from this understanding to a worship life which encapsulates the whole of the person. As with the Christian life, a right understanding of the scriptures is directly connected with the worship life of the church. And all of this is what leads, in Paul's mind, to the unity of the church. This last point is an important one to drive home. Paul never saw unity as something accomplished through compromising theology, but by properly engaging it and understanding it. And a proper theology, along with the unity that flows from it, was always on the forefront of Paul's mind. Thank you for joining us for our Bible study as we continue to look at the life of the Apostle Paul. I hope all of you have a wonderful day. We invite you to also join us tomorrow, Thursday at 1 p.m. for our Zoom discussion over this study. Thank you, and God bless.